Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that's honestly both fascinating and, well, heartbreaking. We're looking at the invisible inheritance of family trauma. We're going to unpack how unresolved parental anxiety literally becomes the psychological operating system, the fundamental software running a kid's mind. It's like looking under the hood of the family unit to see how the survival tactics we learn as kids end up totally running the show when we're adults.
So, here's a wild question for you. Why do we inherit our parents' trauma without a single raised voice? Seriously, when we think of trauma, we usually picture these huge, explosive movie-level events, right? But the research tells a totally different story. Generational pain? It's stealthy. It's transmitted silently, traveling across decades through a subtle tone of voice, a look, or even just absolute silence.
To really get how this works, we've got to look at this groundbreaking psychiatrist, Murray Bowen. Back in the late 1950s, he did something completely unheard of at the National Institute of Mental Health. He literally moved entire families, young adults diagnosed with schizophrenia and their parents, right onto a hospital ward so he could watch them 24/7. Wild, right? And what he saw completely changed the game. He realized that families actually produce their own emotional weather. And the kicker? One family member inevitably ends up absorbing the absolute brunt of that storm. Which brings us to Section 1, the family emotional system.
So, Bowen realized we have to stop looking at people like they exist in a vacuum. His big idea was fusion, this overlap between our emotional and intellectual functioning. Picture a family with high fusion. There's basically zero emotional boundary between anyone. It means if one person is chronically anxious, it doesn't just stay with them, it spreads like a virus to everyone else. And the more fused a family is, the more everyone's life is just driven by these automatic knee-jerk emotional reactions, instead of, conscious logical choices.
All right, let's move on to Section 2, the family projection process.
So how does that floating anxiety actually land on someone? It happens through what's called the family projection process. This is basically the main highway parents use to pass their emotional baggage down to a child. The parents' unspoken fears settle quietly onto one specific kid, usually the one who's most deeply attuned to them. And this intense, anxiety-driven focus, it actually messes with the child's development. It wires them with deep relationship sensitivities, like this desperate need for approval or feeling completely responsible for everyone else's happiness.
Now, this faulty software gets installed in 3 really insidious steps. First, the parent fixates on the child because they're terrified something is wrong with them. Second, the parent looks at totally normal kid behavior and thinks, aha, see, I knew it. And third, they start treating the child as if they're actually broken. It's this toxic loop of scanning, diagnosing, and treating. And because the parent is trying so hard to fix this imagined problem, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The kid's development is so warped by this dynamic that they literally grow up to embody those exact fears.
That takes us to Section 3, narcissism and projective identification.
Now, we need to be very clear here. We're not just talking about a parent who's having a bad day or gets a bit critical. A truly narcissistic parent has this pervasive, everyday pattern of grandiosity and just a total lack of empathy. They see their child simply as an extension of themselves. To them, the kid only exists to fulfill their unmet needs or make them look good to the outside world. The devastating result of that? The child only ever receives conditional love, based 100% on how well they perform.
In that kind of environment, things reach a really dark extreme known as projective identification. This is a concept from psychologist Melanie Klein. See, narcissistic parents are deeply fractured inside. They literally split off the parts of themselves they hate, like their own aggression or feelings of worthlessness. But they don't just project those bad traits onto a scapegoat kid. No, it's much worse. They actively provoke the child into acting out those traits. They might relentlessly tease or unfairly blame the child, essentially controlling their own hidden demons by controlling the kid. It's an incredibly heavy burden for a child to carry.
Let's look at what that does internally in Section 4, creating the false self.
Drawing on the work of psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, we start to see this tragic internal split happen inside the child. Their true self, that natural, spontaneous, completely authentic core, it just goes right into hiding. Why? Because being authentic just isn't safe. So instead, to survive, the child builds a false self. This is a purely defensive mask, built entirely to meet everyone else's expectations. The kid literally has to betray who they really are just to get a scrap of attachment and survive that emotional desert.
This whole dynamic leads to what Alice Miller brilliantly called emotional parentification in her book, The Drama of the Gifted Child. The child quickly learns the golden rule of their house. Love and safety only come if I act as my parent's emotional caretaker. So they become a shapeshifter. They morph into whatever role the parent needs and tie their entire sense of self-worth to that performance. But keeping that false self running, it completely drains their internal battery, leaving them constantly exhausted. When a kid is forced to adapt to all this parentification and emotional neglect, that distress has to go somewhere, right? It basically splits into two paths. You have internalizing outcomes, where the distress gets pointed inwards. Think severe depression, anxiety, and self-erasure. Then you have externalizing outcomes, where distress points outwards to gain a sense of control, leading to aggression, controlling others, or acting out. And here is where it gets absolutely tragic. Imagine an external system, like the courts or family services, stepping in to fix things, but they have huge blind spots. When these systems get it wrong, say, pushing out a loving, protective parent and leaving kids trapped with a narcissistic one, the very system meant to protect the child accidentally installs the exact software of control. The trauma needed to become controlling or abusive later in life gets hardwired in. The code for lifelong distress is literally being written under the guise of keeping them safe.
Which leads us to a really difficult reality in Section 5. The protector becomes persecutor.
Jungian analyst Donald Kalshed points out something fascinating about this. That false self the child built, it functions like this fierce internal guardian. But because it was created when you were so incredibly young, its logic is totally primitive and absolute. Its entire operating principle is this: to keep you safe from the world, I must keep you isolated from the world.
And here, my friends, is the grand, tragic irony of surviving childhood trauma. Hypervigilance, perfectionism, over-responsibility, false self-sufficiency. These were absolute genius survival strategies when you were a kid. Your hypervigilance kept you safe. You had to read the emotional weather before even walking into a room. But now, as an adult, they're costing you everything. That old self-care system goes rogue. It turns into an inner persecutor that attacks you with shame and anxiety the second you try to be vulnerable or actually connect with another human being.
But there's hope. Let's get into Section 6, Breaking the Generational Cycle. Okay, deep breath. The good news is we absolutely can break this cycle. Modern trauma therapies really focus on helping you realize that these exhausting symptoms were just your body's brilliant way of surviving danger. As Jungian analyst Robert A. Johnson explored, we don't just repress our dark side. In a toxic family system, expressing your positive traits, your gold, was dangerous too. So healing is actually about going into the shadows and reclaiming those repressed pieces of yourself, your assertiveness, your creativity. They aren't threats, they're your hidden strengths. You have to actively reclaim that true self.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question to really chew on. If your entire defense system was built just to survive your past, who could you become if you finally laid those weapons down? Look, the software of control was installed in your mind without your permission, no doubt about it. But today, you have the power to write an entirely new operating system. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep healing, and I'll see you next time.